Facing the unthinkable at sea, Barron Trump targeted and was under fire when, how he did it stunned all and sundry. Elysian Voyager was the floating palace in the gleaming white hull slicing effortlessly through calm waters of the Pacific. That wasn't the cruise, this was an experience for those wanting luxury unparalleled anywhere, far removed from the everyday din and the cacophony of life. For Barron Trump, it was just what he needed. Standing on the upper deck, he leaned against the polished railing, the salty breeze tousling his hair. At just over 6 feet tall, with a quiet, composed demeanor, he had grown into a man who preferred observation to spectacle. The far-off horizon glowed orange and pink, the sun setting in a masterpiece that not even the greatest galleries could compete with. Beside him stood Isabel, her auburn hair catching fire with every ray of light. She wasn't a face the tabloids would recognize, and that was intentional. Isabel was smart, grounded, and fiercely private, a rare combination in Barron's world. She adjusted the scarf around her neck, glancing over at him with a playful smile. "You're thinking too much," she teased, nudging his arm gently. Barron smirked, turning his gaze toward her. "Just enjoying the moment." "You're trying to enjoy it," she corrected, her tone warm but knowing. "Big difference." He laughed softly, the sound carried away by the wind. She wasn't wrong. Even on this decadent retreat, he couldn't quite turn off. Years of living under a microscope had conditioned him to be constantly on guard, ever mindful of how one photo or careless remark might mushroom into weeks of headlines. Isabel had suggested the cruise as an opportunity for them to get out of the public eye and just be themselves. For the first 2 days, it was working. They roamed the ship like any other passengers, indulging in sumptuous feasts, lying by the pool, and gazing at the ocean that seemed to stretch endlessly. At night, they walked under a starlit canopy, seeking comfort in the silence that their lives hardly ever provided. However, not everyone on the Elysian Voyager was equally thrilled about their visit. Several times, Barron had seen Captain Hargrove lingering on the edge of his field of vision, his sharp blue eyes lingering a fraction of a moment too long. Hargrove was a presence, a tall, broad-shouldered man, and the kind of grizzled authority that inspired respect. His uniform was impeccable, his stride purposeful, but his gaze carried something unnerving. "Have you noticed him staring?" Barron asked Isabel one afternoon as they lounged on the sun deck. "Who?" she asked, peering up from her book. "The captain," Barron replied, nodding discreetly in the direction of the man standing by the bridge. Isabel followed his eyes. Hargrove was addressing a crewman, but looked over at them as she raised her head. His face was inscrutable, but his eyes lingered on them for a fraction of a second too long before returning to his conversation. "He's probably just being nosy," Isabel said, attempting to laugh it off. "You're not exactly incognito." Barron's eyebrows furrowed, but he said nothing. He was accustomed to people staring. This was just different, however, as though he wasn't being watched at all, only sized up. Later that evening, as they sat in the elaborate garden bistro, Barron felt it again, an impression of scrutiny. The captain made a half-hearted appearance in the dining room, moving up and down its length to take his turn acknowledging guests. He stopped in front of their table, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Enjoying your voyage, Mr. Trump?" Hargrove asked, his tone polite but clipped. "Yes, thank you," Barron replied, his voice measured. Hargrove's gaze flicked to Isabel, then back to Barron. "Good. If there is something I can do to make your stay more memorable." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Isabel looked at Barron, who shrugged his shoulders, refusing to let the man ruin their evening. For a while, it seemed like nothing more than an odd moment, a quirk of a man used to running a tight ship. But deep down, Barron couldn't ignore the unease it stirred. The Elysian Voyager might have promised a sanctuary away from the public eye, but something about this journey felt different. And soon, they'd find out just how fast a wonderful getaway took a dark and sinister turn. Morning sunlight streamed across the Elysian Voyager as it sailed off into the open water. The swaying of the ship was almost undetectable, and all could flow through the decks without a care, sipping morning coffee or crashing out onto deck chairs for days of slobbery indulgence. Barron and Isabel went out to the promenade. The sun was warm on their faces, and the spirits of the people aboard were lifted. Breakfast at the garden bistro had become a favorite routine for them. The bistro, located on the upper deck with panoramic views of the ocean, offered a feeling of peaceful detachment from the world. Tables were set with crisp white linens, and the soft clinking of silverware merged with the waves lapping against the hull. Isabel took a sip of freshly squeezed orange juice, her vision sweeping across the tables. Families laughed over stacks of pancakes, an older man read a thick paperback, while the waiters glided between the guests with casual grace. It was a scene from a travel brochure, serene, perfect. "You're smiling," Isabel said, leaning forward with a smirk. Barron looked up from his plate, and his lips curled into a small grin. "Am I not allowed to?" he asked. "It's just rare," she replied, her voice light but full of affection. "Nice, though. You seem happy." He settled back in his chair, breathed a sigh, letting the moment be washed over him. "Maybe I am," he said. "At least here, I'm not that guy from the headlines. Just me. See? I told you this trip would be good for you," Isabel said with a wink, popping a strawberry into her mouth. Across the deck, a group of children ran past, laughing. Barron looked at them and smiled faintly to himself, feeling a reminder of simpler times, before his name became a household word synonymous with controversy and scrutiny. But as he drank in the peace around him, the unease nagged in the back of his mind. It wasn't just the man's behavior that unsettled him, it was how misplaced it was against the ship's smooth polish. Hargrove had passed by their table an hour before, nodding at them brusquely, but his eyes had lingered on Barron for a split second too long. It was as if the captain were sizing him up, trying to unlock some hidden piece of himself. "Do you think he's always like that?" Barron asked suddenly. "Who?" Isabel asked, putting down her glass. "The captain," Barron said, looking slightly sideways toward the bridge where Hargrove was speaking to a crew member. Isabel followed his line of sight. "He's probably just old school, you know, the kind of guy who's all about order and respect." "Maybe." Barron mumbled, though he wasn't really buying it. And indeed, the day went by with a deafening hum of noise. Kids dove into the water with splashes and shouts while adults relaxed around frozen drinks. Soft music floated over the pool deck, as played by a live jazz band next to the bar, setting up a background for leisurely activity, washing away all concerns from the minds of passengers. Barron and Isabel strolled about the decks, sometimes stepping inside to check out some of the ship's boutiques, but otherwise standing and staring out at the expanse of the ocean. Isabel found a dainty bracelet in a jewelry store, and Barron surprised her by buying it. Before she could protest, "Stop spoiling me," she chided, though her smile betrayed her delight. "It's not spoiling if you deserve it," he replied with a smirk. As evening approached, the anticipation for the ship's formal gala grew. Guests returned to their cabins to change into their finest attire, all eager for one night of glamour. Barron and Isabel joined the others, taking their time in getting ready. He opted for a tailored navy suit, while she donned a flowing emerald gown that makes her look like she has come out from a classic Hollywood film. The grand ballroom was a sight to behold, its high ceilings adorned with ornate chandeliers that cast a warm golden glow. Softly played a string quartet in the corner, elegantly dressed guests sipping champagne and mingling. Isabel and Barron came in arm, and they drew attention subtly but noticeable to the crowd. "You're turning heads," Isabel whispered as they made their way to the dance floor. "So are you," Barron replied, spinning her gently as they moved to the rhythm of the music. For a time, it seemed that the weight of the outside world could not intrude, not for what felt like an eternity. They laughed, they danced, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, Barron let himself be. But there were those who did not. From a balcony above, Captain Hargrove stood silent, his features outlined in dark relief beneath the dim light. He placed his hand on the railing and let his fingers drum out a slow, measured rhythm. He watched Barron steadily. His features were unreadable but tense. A steward appeared beside the captain to offer him a glass of champagne. Hargrove waved at the drink without diverting his gaze from Barron. "They all think they are above the law," he mumbled to himself, his voice overwhelmed by the sounds of music from below. Back on the dance floor, Barron and Isabel shared a quiet moment as the music softened. He looked into her eyes, his hand resting gently on her waist. "This is perfect," Isabel said softly. "It is," Barron agreed, though the lingering presence of Hargrove in his peripheral vision left a faint chill in his otherwise perfect evening. But as the night aged, cracks were about to appear in the seemingly peaceful facade of the ship, and no one could foretell the chaos brewing just beneath the surface. The Elysian Voyager's grand ballroom was the very essence of elegance, its high ceilings hung with dripping crystal chandeliers. Every detail, from polished marble floors and gold-accented columns, expressed an opulence that made one feel as though they had traveled into another epoch. Soft strings of classical music played quietly in the backdrop as guests mingled, their laughter intermingled with the muted clinking glasses. Barron and Isabel stood in the vicinity of the dance floor, chatting away with a couple they had met on the day. The emerald dress of Isabel shimmered in the golden light as she caught more than a few admiring glances from the guests. Barron was, as ever, the gentleman, composed, his polite smiles and reserved conversation easing the tension among those around him. As they spoke, the huge doors of the ballroom suddenly swung open with a force that silenced the room. The music halted mid-note and the general murmur of conversation silenced, leaving a heavy, oppressive quiet. All turned to the intruder. In the doorway, Captain Hargrove loomed, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over the polished floor. His hat was gone, his once immaculate uniform slightly awry, and his face flushed with what could have been anger, drink, or possibly both. He had a half-empty glass of whiskey in his right hand, the liquid sloshing inside as he stepped forward. "There he is!" Hargrove bellowed, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. His eyes fixed on Barron, who instinctively straightened, his calm demeanor masking the unease bubbling beneath the surface. The captain's words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. "The golden boy hiding out here like he's just one of us," Hargrove continued, his voice dripping with disdain. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the edge of a table. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, whispers rippling through the crowd as Hargrove's words sank in. Barron felt Isabel's hand tighten around his arm, her tension radiating through her grip. "What is he doing?" Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible. Barron didn't say a word, his eyes fixed on the captain, studying him intently. This wasn't the calculated disdain of a man merely enforcing his authority, this was personal. Hargrove began moving toward them, his steps heavy and unsteady. "You think you can just walk in here, waltzing around like you own the place?" he spat, his voice growing louder with each step, his words slurring slightly. "You don't belong here. Not you. Not your kind." The room fell utterly silent, the weight of his words sinking in. A few passengers gasped, while others glanced at Barron, unsure of what to expect. "Captain," Barron said evenly, his voice calm but firm, "you've had a lot to drink. This isn't the time or place." "Oh, it's the perfect time," Hargrove shot back, slamming his glass down on a nearby table with a loud clatter. "You think I don't know who you are? I know exactly who you are. I've spent years watching people like you, entitled, arrogant, taking whatever you want without a second thought for the rest of us." Barron didn't flinch, though his chest tightened. He had faced public confrontations before, but this was different. This wasn't a reporter ambushing him with a question or a stranger snapping photos. This was unadulterated hostility. "Look, I don't know what you think I've done," Barron said in a voice that was flat and laced with quiet authority, "but I'm not going to stand here and let you insult me or the people in this room." Hargrove laughed a sharp, hollow sound. "Oh, the prince speaks. How noble." He took a step closer, lowering his voice into a near growl. "You don't belong here, and I'm not the only one who knows it." Isabel tugged at Barron's arm, her voice urgent. "Let's just leave. This isn't worth it." But Barron didn't move. He met Hargrove's glare head-on, his expression calm but unyielding. "Captain, I'm going to ask you to step back and take some time to cool off. Whatever this is, we can talk about it privately." "Privately?" Hargrove barked, his voice rising once more. "No. No more secrets. People need to know the truth about you and your family. They need to see what you really are." The murmurs among the guests grew louder, tension rippling through the room like an electric current. A crew member standing near the entrance took a tentative step forward, his face pale. "Captain, maybe we should step outside," he said warily. But Hargrove waved him off. "Don't tell me how to run my ship," he snapped, his eyes still fixed on Barron. "This isn't over, kid. Not by a long shot." The two senior officers approached the captain deliberately but non-confrontationally. "Sir, we need to speak with you," said one of them, placing a firm hand on Hargrove's shoulder. For a moment, Hargrove seemed about to push himself away, but then he breathed out, frustrated, and turned away for the officers to nudge him toward the door. He cast one last glance at Barron, his eyes burning with resentment. "You'll regret this," he muttered under his breath before disappearing into the hallway. The ballroom remained silent for several beats, the weight of what had just happened hanging in the air. Slowly, the music resumed, but the festive atmosphere was gone. Conversations were hushed, the guests exchanging uneasy glances as they tried to process the scene. Barron exhaled, his shoulders relaxing a little as he turned toward Isabel. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, but her expression was still taut. "What was that?" she asked. He shook his head. "No idea," Barron said, "but something in me says this isn't over." Even as the ballroom settled back into a tense calm, the real storm was only just starting to brew. The ballroom was still abuzz with whispers long after Captain Hargrove was escorted out. Guests clutched their glasses a little tighter, their polished small talk being replaced by murmured speculation. The elegant atmosphere was pierced, and the suspense that spread did not dissipate even with the soft strain of music in the air. Barron and Isabel stood near the entrance, watching as the night limped back into its rhythm. "We should go," Isabel said softly, her voice tinged with worry. Barron nodded, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back as he guided her toward the exit. Heads turned as they passed, whispers following them like a shadow. Isabel's grip on his arm tightened, but Barron kept his expression calm and composed, even as his mind raced. The corridors outside the ballroom were quieter, a hum of the ship's engines the only sound accompanying their footsteps. Isabel let out a shaky breath, her voice low but urgent. "Barron, what just happened? Why would he come after you like that?" "I don't know," Barron replied, his voice steady but his jaw tense. It felt personal, though not undefined. He wasn't just venting, he's holding on to something. Isabel frowned. "Maybe he is just unstable or drunk. Either way, this does not feel safe." Barron glanced up and down the empty hallway, his eyes narrowing as he considered her words. "This is more than that. Do you hear what he said about my family? This is not some random attack." Isabel hesitated, her brow furrowed with concern. "Do you think he believes in one of those conspiracy theories? The ones they put out online about your family?" "It wouldn't be the first time," Barron said bitterly. He paused, his gaze distant for a moment. But this felt different. He seemed certain, like he has some kind of personal grudge. As they reached their suite, Barron swiped his key card and pushed the door open, holding it for Isabel. Once inside, the familiar luxury of their cabin did little to ease the tension hanging in the air. Isabel perched on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Barron leaned against the wall, crossing his arms as he considered his options. "If I report him, this whole thing becomes a headline, Barron Trump confronts unhinged captain. It'll spiral out of control, and no one will care about what really happened." Isabel tilted her head, studying him. "So, you're just going to do nothing?" "No," Barron said firmly. "But I need to figure out what he's holding on to. This must be about me or my family. I wouldn't just look away." She stepped forward, and the distance disappeared. "You're not going to confront him, are you?" "That man is dangerous, Barron. You saw how he acted tonight." "I won't do something stupid," Barron said. "But if he approaches me again, then I'll have to take matters into my hands. I'm not going to let him keep this ship in chaos just because he has a chip on his shoulder." Isabel shrugged, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I just don't want you to get hurt. This was supposed to be our escape, remember?" Barron placed a hand on her cheek, softening his features. "I know, and I'm not going to let him ruin it for us. Whatever this is, I'll make sure it doesn't go any further." The night stretched on, but Barron could not sleep. Long after Isabel had fallen asleep, he lay there, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He could not rid himself of the words Hargrove had flung at him, each one cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He had lived his whole life under the weight of his family's name,
with the burden of both admiration and animosity.
But this was different. Hargrove's anger wasn't fueled by idle gossip or baseless rumors, it carried a sharp, deliberate edge that hinted at something deeper. By the time dawn broke, Barron had made up his mind. He couldn't wait for Hargrove to make the next move. Whatever the captain's motives, Barron needed answers before things spiraled any further. The first opportunity came later that morning, during a meeting with the ship's head of security. After the events of the previous night, the crew had decided to keep a closer eye on Hargrove, whose behavior had proven questionable even to the most loyal officers. "We've reviewed some of the security footage from last night," the officer explained, his tone measured.
"It's concerning.
There's evidence that Captain Hargrove's actions weren't entirely impulsive." Barron leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing.
"What do you mean?"
The officer hesitated, glancing at Isabel before continuing. "He was watching you throughout the day, on the promenade, at the garden bistro, even during the gala. And before he entered the ballroom, he spent time in his quarters pacing, muttering to himself."
He was clearly agitated. "Agitated about what?" Isabel asked, her voice tight.
"We're still looking into it," the officer admitted.
"But there's something else. He's been corresponding with someone, a journalist."
"We haven't seen the extent of their communication yet, but it seems he's been planning to leak information about your family." Barron's jaw clenched, but his voice remained steady. "So this wasn't just a drunken outburst. He was targeting me."
The officer nodded. "That's how it appears. And from what he is doing, we are advising you to stay away from him until the end of the trip."
But Barron shook his head, his resolve hardening.
"No.
If he's holding on to something, I need to know what it is."
"You're not going to confront him, are you?" Isabel's eyes widened.
"That man is dangerous as Barron." "I'm not afraid of him," Barron said firmly.
"If he has something to say, I want to hear it. And I want to make it clear that I'm not going to be intimidated."
The officer hesitated but eventually nodded. "If you're sure about this, I'll arrange for you to meet him in a controlled environment."
"But I strongly advise caution."
Barron nodded, his expression resolute.
"I'll handle it."
But the closer the meeting date drew, the more Barron sensed that his battle with Hargrove was merely an opening skirmish in a far greater conflict. The day after the confrontation in the ballroom, things felt different aboard the Elysian Voyager.
Gone was the vibrancy of life on board.
Curiosity had replaced that lively energy, mingled with a sense of tension. Passengers grouped themselves in knots on the sun deck, their murmurs conveyed scraps of the mayhem last night. "I heard that Captain completely went nuts," whispered one woman animatedly, her voice hushed yet dramatic.
"Wasn't he yelling at that Trump son?"
"Would you believe?" her peer replied, shaking her head. Barron and Isabel kept their profile low, they would order breakfast on the less crowded part of the promenade deck. The normal murmur of talk in the garden bistro was sharper, more pointed. Periodically, a guest glanced their way and looked away hastily when Barron's gaze met theirs. Isabel shifted uncomfortably in her seat, not touching her coffee. "They're all talking about it," she whispered.
"Let them," Barron said quietly, though his grip on his fork betrayed frustration.
Isabel leaned in, lowering her voice an octave below what one could argue was already too soft. "Some of the crew are saying this isn't the first time Hargrove's acted like this. Apparently, he's had problems before, especially with passengers he identifies as privileged."
Barron arched an eyebrow.
"Problems like what?"
"Someone mentioned he had a disagreement with senatorial family members a few years ago on another voyage."
"Rumor is he has a thing against people in power," Isabel said, glancing around as if expecting someone to overhear. Barron sighed, leaning back in his chair.
"So this isn't just about me. It's about what I represent to him."
Before Isabel could respond, a steward approached their table, his demeanor nervous. "Mr. Trump," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "Captain Hargrove has requested a private meeting with you in his quarters this afternoon." Isabel's eyes widened, her hand tightening on Barron's arm. "Undefined, absolutely not," she said quickly, looking at the steward. "Undefined." The steward hesitated, clearly caught in an awkward position. "Undefined, I understand your hesitation, ma'am, but the captain insisted." Barron frowned, his mind racing. A meeting with Hargrove felt like walking into the lion's den, but at the same time, it could be an opportunity to get answers. He glanced at Isabel, whose expression was a mix of worry and disbelief. "I'll meet him," Barron said finally, his voice steady. "Barron, no," Isabel protested. "You can't." "I'll be fine," he assured her. Turning to the steward, he added, "Tell him I'll be there," but he did not know how far it would spin. Based on his actions, he's not thinking straight. That makes him unpredictable and dangerous. The intercom in the security office crackled to life, cutting through the silence. "Perez, we've got a situation," a voice said urgently. "The captain's on the intercom again. He's addressing the passengers." Perez's eyes went wide, and he turned to the console, switching to the ship's public announcement system. Hargrove's voice came through, sharp and filled with anger. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his voice dripping with venom, "you've all been having a wonderful cruise, haven't you? But how many of you know the truth behind who you are sharing this trip with? The golden boy of a corrupt dynasty walking among us like he's one of us. Barron Trump and his family have taken everything from people like me, and they keep getting away with it." Gasps and murmurs rustled through the security office as Perez quickly muted the broadcast. "He's escalating," Perez said, his voice clipped. "We have to stop this now." Isabel looked at Barron, worry written on her face. "You cannot let him lead the way on this. If you do not say anything, he is going to allow this story to swirl around until everyone believes him." Barron nodded slowly, his face a hard mask. "You're right. I need to confront him, but on my terms." Perez could only hesitate. Confronting him may be dangerous. "He's unstable and unpredictable," she explained. "I'm not afraid of him," Barron stated confidently. "But I won't let him turn this into a circus anymore. I need to see him and end this," Perez sighed but eventually nodded. "We'll have your back, but watch out. This isn't just about you anymore, he's dragging everyone on this ship into his vendetta." Perez and his team continued to search for the captain while Barron took a moment to collect himself. Isabel stood by his side, her voice soft but resolute. "You don't have to do this alone." "Yes, I do," Barron replied, his tone calm but determined. "This is my fight, but I'll make sure it doesn't hurt anyone else." Moments later, Perez's crew found Hargrove in the control room of the ship. Barron followed the officers down a cramped passageway, his head racing. He did not know what to say, but one thing he was sure of: this had to stop. But as Barron approached the control room, he couldn't help but feel that Hargrove's anger was just part of something much bigger, far more sinister. The control room of the Elysian Voyager was a world away from the glittering beauty of the ship. It was functional and utilitarian, buzzing with the low hum of machinery and the faint murmur of radio chatter. Captain Hargrove stood at the helm, his hands gripping the edge of the control panel with an intensity that turned the knuckles white. His uniform was pressed immaculately, but his work-worn energy couldn't be hidden, disheveled and erratic. Barron stepped into the room, flanked by Perez and two senior officers. Isabel had wanted to be here, but Barron insisted she wait at home. She wasn't meant to see this confrontation. His calm exterior belied the storm of emotions swirling within him: anger, frustration, but also a strange resolve to understand the man who had turned his vacation into a nightmare. Hargrove turned as the door clicked shut, his piercing blue eyes narrowing when he saw Barron. "So, you decided to show up," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'm here because I want this to end," Barron replied even as he moved forward. "This has gone too far, Captain. Whatever you think you're proving, it's only hurting yourself and everyone else on this ship." Hargrove laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You think I care about what happens to me? This isn't about me, kid. It's about justice. Your family has taken everything from people like me. You represent everything that's wrong with this world." Barron's brow furrowed. "You always say my family has stolen everything. Tell me what that means. What happened to you?" The room went silent for a moment, save for the soft sound of waves crashing against the hull. Hargrove's gaze grew harder, but his voice betrayed him as he spoke. "You wouldn't understand. People like you never do. My brother was on the sea horizon.
He was part of the crew when that ship went down because of cost-cutting and greed. He went down with it. Barron's eyes softened. He remembered the Sea Horizon tragedy, a shipwreck that had made headlines for months, its aftermath steeped in controversy over safety violations. His father's firm had been linked in initial accounts of the case, but those allegations have since been retracted. Regardless, the word was already out there. "I'm sorry for your loss," Barron said truthfully. "But my family wasn't connected to what transpired. I know why you're angry. Your blame just isn't focused on the right party." "Not focused?" Hargrove's voice began to climb in anger. "Your father's company was part of the same web of corruption that allowed that ship to sail. He may not have signed the papers, but he knew. People like him always know." Barron took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "Even if that was true, you're punishing the wrong person. I did not make those choices. I didn't even have enough maturity to know. Whatever my dad did or did not do wasn't going to define who I was. You're allowing anger blind your decision." Hargrove's hold on the panel tightened, his whole body started quivering in its restraint over his emotions. "You don't get it, do you? People like me don't have the luxury of walking away from our pain. We carry it every day, while people like you move on without a second thought." "I do get it," Barron said, his voice steady but tinged with empathy. "I do know what it's like to live under someone else's weight of acts. I know what it is to be judged about things you do not do. But that weight does not need to consume you." The air in the room became silent. One could feel a tension, so still did they seem, and Hargrove seemed to fight with Barron. His eyes did flicker at uncertainty as now the anger did mingle with a different feeling, the pain. Perez stepped forward cautiously. "Captain, it's over. Let us help you." Hargrove's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as he leaned against the console. I wanted someone to see," he murmured, "to understand what it's like." "I see it," Barron said softly. "And I know it's not fair. But this isn't the way to make things right. Let the crew handle this. Let them help you." Hargrove nodded faintly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The officers moved in carefully, placing a hand on his arm as they led him away. He didn't resist. As the door closed behind them, Barron exhaled deeply, his composure finally cracking as the weight of the confrontation settled on him. He leaned against the console, staring out at the endless expanse of ocean. Minutes later, Isabel burst into the room, her face etched with worry. "Are you okay?" she asked, rushing to his side. "I'm fine," Barron said, his voice quiet. "It's over." She touched his cheek, her eyes probing his. "You shouldn't have had to go through that. None of this was your fault." "I know," Barron said, his voice firm. "But if I hadn't stood up to him, he would have hurt someone else. Now, at least he'll get the help he needs." The crew on the ship sprang into action to regain order, and when the Elysian Voyager finally docked, the news was already breaking. Reporters from all over began to scramble for information, eager to sensationalize the story as another scandal attached to the Trump name. But passengers who had witnessed the events firsthand told a different story, one of composure, compassion, and courage in the face of chaos. As Barron and Isabel disembarked, a passenger approached them, a middle-aged man who had watched the ballroom confrontation unfold. "I just wanted to say, you handled yourself with class back there," the man said. "Not everyone could have done that." "Thank you," Barron replied, offering a faint smile. As they walked toward the terminal, Isabel slipped her hand into his. "Do you think this changes anything?" she asked. Barron glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Probably not. People will believe what they want to believe. But that doesn't matter. What matters is how we handle ourselves. That's all we can control." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "And you handled it better than anyone else could have." Barron smiled faintly, the weight of the experience still heavy on his shoulders but tempered by a quiet sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he'd proven something, not to the world, but to himself. Life isn't about what's thrown at us, it's about how we rise to meet it. In the end, it is not the opinions of others that define us,
but the choices we make when no one else is watching. If this story has moved you, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge us to think, reflect, and grow.